What's happening, people? Welcome back to another episode of the Athletes to Athletes podcast. Today, I talk with Dr. Matt Bowers, the Associate Professor of Instruction and the Director of the Sports Management Program at the University of Texas. We discuss the role of sports in generating positive experiences and outcomes and how those experiences impact athletes in their most developmental years. So I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Dr. Bowers, and as always, I appreciate you listening to the A2A podcast. So we are back here on the A2A podcast, and today sitting down with Dr. Matt Bowers. And Matt, as we were just talking, I'm really intrigued by everything that you've had a chance to study and write about and be a part of. And I can't wait to get into the conversation today. But to start, I honestly just want to give you a chance to introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I'm really stoked to be here. Yeah, as you might be able to tell, I am a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. We, as we're recording this, our beloved Horns have a Sweet 16 game tonight on the men's side, so I had to show my colors here. So I'm an associate professor of instruction. I am the director of our sport management program here at the University of Texas, and I'm also somebody who does a lot of research and a lot of work in the area, broadly speaking, of youth sports. Whether that's understanding youth athlete development and how we create better sports programs and systems, to create better experiences and outcomes, or whether that is working with administrators, coaches, parents. And really, I'm fortunate to be able to zoom out and have the full view of this athlete development, youth sports ecosystem that is, obviously at the heart of what A2A is trying to serve, and help kids and parents navigate what is seemingly an increasingly complex process. And so I'm really fortunate that I get to do that for my job. I get to work with organizations who are also grappling with these issues. I've worked a lot with the Aspen Institute and their Project Play initiative, which is, if you're not familiar with it, as a listener, it's probably where the most impact is happening in terms of youth sports reform. They've got everybody at the table. It's a really cool organization run by Tom Ferry, a good friend of mine and former ESPN journalist. I just finished up a term on the President's Council for Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition, their science board, where our task was to take the national youth sports strategy and to think about how we implement that, in real terms. And so these are issues that I get to think about, wrestle with, try to help with on a day-to-day basis. And I think what I love so much about this area is that it's not perfectly solvable, right? We're not going to, in an instant, fix all the issues that are happening, but we can make progress. We can tinker around the edges. We can move the needle in positive ways, and that's really what I try to help do. Yeah.
And now, like, with your current stance in sports, I kind of want to go back, a little bit to your youth days. How big were sports for you growing up, and what truly made you kind of intrigued you about sports as a youth?
Yeah, so I've almost out of the womb, I have been obsessed with sports. But my story's a little bit different than maybe the typical person who says that and has had that experience. So I come from a family, and actually I wrote a textbook for an introduction to sport management course, and in the dedication to that textbook, I thank my parents, my brother, my now wife, for the fact that they never cared about sports. So I come from a family where like I thought I was adopted and weird because when I was in second grade, I wanted to, I carried the sports section from the newspaper around, and the newspaper, that's a thing that we used to have back when I was a kid. I would carry that around and talk to grownups about trades and free agent signings. And I've just always been fascinated by teams, why some are better than others, why it's so challenging to create and sustain a high performing team. And again, I think that kind of harkens back to my specific background of being growing up in the Tampa Bay area, right along the beach there, the Gulf Coast of Florida, and all the teams I liked sucked. And so I think it was, my fascination came from wanting to understand, well, why are these other teams so good and the teams that I like maybe not as good? Mm-hmm. And then I kind of carried that forward. I always wanted to work in sports and be a general manager when I was a little kid or something like that. And the further along I got, I played basketball in high school. I guess basketball was kind of my sport, but I've always loved all sorts of different sports. And I went to the University of Florida and did my undergraduate and my master's degrees in sport management. While there, I worked a number of seasons with the football program in sort of recruiting and compliance. I transitioned to work with the women's basketball program as a graduate assistant when I was a master's student. So basically like a grad student coach with the women's program at the University of Florida. Started an AAU program, or co-founded, I should say, an AAU program. And so, the further along I got, the more I started going down a kind of a coaching path. And the further I got along that coaching path, the more I realized, no, I don't really want to coach. There are things I love about competing in sports and that environment, but there are things I didn't love about it. Parents being one of them. Sorry, parents. The sort of the highs and the lows of that environment. I'm a pretty even keel dude. I'm also a nerd. And at the time when I was coaching, it was not as nerdy an environment as it is these days. Mm-hmm. And so, the closer I got to really committing to head down that coaching path at the collegiate level, and one of my good friends and my co-GA during that time, a guy named Bill Ferrara, has stayed in the coaching world and is the lead assistant at Florida State for their women's program. So we kind of diverged and took different paths, and I ended up coming in to the University of Texas and doing a PhD in athlete development and sport development. So basically, like, I got to keep thinking about and wrestling with the things that I found fascinating about sports. I got to do it a little bit more on my own terms. And I only after the fact did I kind of come around to seeing that being a professor is not a whole lot different than being a coach, but it actually like takes away a lot of the things that I didn't like about the coaching career, and then highlights a lot of the things that I did like about it. So I couldn't be happier with where I am and getting to, continue to wrestle with these same issues, but just from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm. So for, without being too, I guess, obtuse about it, like, you studied sports and you have continued to study sports from every angle. As you got into the higher education ranks of studying sports, what were some of those things that you started to learn that made you even more intrigued and go down that rabbit hole of, okay, this is something that harkens back to my days of being a third grader carrying around that newspaper?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because it is one of those things that Well, we always joke about this. Like when you get a PhD in something, when you become an expert in it, and it's your focus on a day-to-day basis, you kind of have to make amends with the fact that like that also can like spoil it a little bit, right? So it as you peel back the layers, you pull back the curtain, you start to see things in a way that maybe isn't as easy to accommodate, versus when you're just a fan and you tune in and you follow. And I'm still a fan, and I'm still that as well. But I think the deeper I got into studying sports, the more I realized that sport as like a context is neither good nor bad, right? Like I think we tend to like infuse it with this like, oh, well, playing sports is a great thing, right? And it can be, right? I was just in the March Madness in the women's and the men's broadcast. You've seen maybe that great Dick's Sporting Goods commercial about like why sports matter, and they do. They're this powerful context, but sort of coming to the point of recognizing that like sports are neutral in that sense. They give us the context, and it's up to how we design and deliver that sport experience to shape the extent to which it's a good or a bad thing. And so that kind of unlocking that realization has helped me see sports in a totally different way. It makes them no less powerful, right? They're incredibly powerful. Your experiences, you were talking about just coming from, was it nationals for NCAA for wrestling?
Yeah.
And the power of that experience for the athletes, for the spectators, for the parents is real. But it's all, like recognizing the fact that it's not the default setting that sports are going to be a good thing for kids or for adults is actually really empowering in and of itself. And it puts responsibility back on us to recognize the role that we play in shaping those experiences and outcomes, whether we're a coach, an athlete, or a parent.
So one of the things you said was that when you started to study, and as we study things, we dive deep into that rabbit hole, right? And I can remember when I got out of college and I was no longer a football player, and I was now the journalist, how when I watched sports as a fan, I couldn't turn that off. I couldn't turn it off that I was watching sports as a fan because I was watching so many as a journalist, right? And before then, I was always watching sports as an athlete. So it was really hard to kind of differentiate. And it wasn't until maybe the last 5 or 10 years that I've truly been able to just watch sports as a fan and cheer for the team that I like and, be in that moment and turn off the fact that I'm a journalist, right? You still have that athlete aspect where, you can break down a defense and watch a game, but like you watching those types of things as a journalist, it's very different than if you're watching them as a true fan. How would you say, and did you notice that as you started to study these things, that your analytical brain was still switched on?
Yeah, no, totally. I absolutely empathize with that. And I bet a lot of the viewers, listeners, do as well. And so, for me, I was fortunate to have those early experiences where, I'm watching Florida Gators football from the sidelines, right? I'm helping coach basketball at the university from the bench. And it's hard for me these days to just go and be in the stands, be in the crowd, well, and also one thing that was hard for me with that is, I've been at the University of Texas for a decade plus, and I have close relationships with tons of our student athletes who you might imagine are, we serve a lot of because it's a topic area and a major that connects with their lives. And I was really struggling with the having to like listen to people around me talk about and criticize the performance of an 18, 19, 20-year-old, what have you, who I cared about. And so, it's not necessarily easy for me to go back into the stands and just watch as a fan. And similar to that, you started to kind of go in this direction, and I'm curious what you think, or how your experiences have been. It's, when we think about, again, these same issues that A2A is interested in, of like, how do we create the best experience, match people up in the best place where they can find happiness and fulfillment and success. One of the things we are really negligent about as a society is helping athletes transition from that identity into a post-athlete existence, right? Because for your whole life, you were the wrestler, right? Like that's the first thing people talk to you about. And I see this all the time with the athletes that we have here at the University of Texas, as they, at varying stages, sort of begin their transition from being a cross-country runner or a football player or whatever it may be to that next version of themselves. We don't do a really good job supporting that and helping athletes through that process. And we also don't do a good job of preparing athletes in how we raise and nurture them in a way that sets them up to be better able to navigate that process, because we so often ascribe entire identities for people to their sport performance. And we don't do a good job of helping them find multiple identities, and things that they can balance who they are and how they navigate the world. And so that's, I don't know if you faced that as well during your own transition period, but it's something I see a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly did. I was fortunate enough to kind of make a quick transition into having a job right out of college, so it didn't hit me quite as hard as getting out of college and having to navigate that, right? But you're still in that mode of, I'm an athlete. And even still to this day, I'll always identify with being an athlete before being a journalist, right? Because, for me, it helps for me to identify as an athlete who became a journalist because of the people that I'm covering are athletes. And they want to be able to have that one-to-one conversation where they know that they can just speak to somebody who understands their perspectives, right? So I didn't, I can't say that I had the wandering in the darkness sort of transition out of college, but like, I certainly did have those thoughts of, okay, this is what I'm doing now, but where is this taking me? Am I going to be able to utilize my degree in journalism and PR and communications to do the things that I want to do? And at that time, obviously podcasting wasn't much of a thing. The newspaper you carried around, I worked for a newspaper coming out of college. Not many people do that much anymore, right? They start their own blogs, or they have their own websites, or, social media is enormous now. Back then in 2009, it wasn't a thing. I took a class to learn Twitter. Facebook, you could only be on it if you were a college student. So it didn't have the same factors that they had that we have now, right? So it was a harder transition. There wasn't as much opportunity to do the things that I'm able to do now, or things that many people are able to do now. But like, certainly, there was that what's next kind of a thing. Is this what I'm going to do? Am I in the right profession? Right. And it was a lot of the imposter syndrome of, wow, this is big business. I'm no longer, I'm on the sidelines. And me being on the sidelines watching this is very much so different than when I had a helmet on, or than when I was preparing to go out and wrestle, right? And, I became an athlete even after college as a fighter too. So as I took a step back, I then jumped headfirst back in and became an athlete once again, because it was all that I knew. And it was a comfort zone to be an athlete and to train and to do those things that I once did as a 21-year-old, 18 to 21-year-old, right? So it was certainly a comfort zone factor. but then once I was done, it was very tough to just be a normal person and not have something to train for or something to look to or a schedule to look to. It was working and watching and going to the gym for no other reason but to be healthy and to have some semblance of normalcy, right? And it's funny because now we have the NFL draft coming up, and they're looking at all these different athletes who don't have the same type of transition that maybe some of their classmates definitely have, where they're getting out of college and they're going into the workforce. These football players are finishing up at their colleges and universities and looking to continue playing their sport. So the transition that a lot of kids have coming out of college that they hit when they're 21, 22, professional athletes might not hit until they're 27, 28, 29, right? Because they're still an athlete. It's still how they identify, and you'll see more athletes that start to get into more things than just being an athlete, more business ventures and stuff like that. But that transition is still much later on, where they focus on it and it doesn't hit them until they're in their 30s and 40s and they don't have somewhere to go where there's a game on the line, and that kind of speaks to something else that you spoke to earlier, with the development of a lot of these players. As you started to study development of young athletes in that 18 to 21-year-old space, what did you start to see was kind of a determining factor for how they felt in that mental health space, right? Where it's like, okay, the youth kids are coming up and they're seeing what the professionals are doing, and then they're going on to become maybe college athletes, but now they have to transition out. How would you kind of explain that development structure as you've seen it through studying?
Yeah. So, I mean, as you know, as I think we all are seeing, we are in a period of time where on the one hand, mental health has never had more attention paid to it.
Mm-hmm.
We've never had more high-level athletes and organizations putting themselves out there in a vulnerable way to discuss their own mental health, their own, the things that they have to navigate in their lives, right? From Naomi Osaka to Kevin Love to, we see this as much more common. Mm-hmm. But it's also something that I've noticed is there's more suffering right now from a mental health standpoint. And we can't just look at that within this sort of like context of like even an age range, right? Like where the things that they're experiencing at 18, there may be an acute moment or something that brings on a mental health crisis, but more than likely it's a more holistic issue that's a part of how they've been raised and their experiences as a student athlete, that really contribute to this. But it's a real epidemic right now. I'm working on a project. I was just brought in on a very cool project with a group that out of the City University of New York. They were at Johns Hopkins previously, led by a really cool scholar named Bruce Lee, where at the system level, using simulation models, we're actually trying to look at the impact that physical activity can have on saving lives, on saving costs, again, at the big zoomed out level. And we've been looking at the physical activity side of this. And now we're really shifting through the support of the Department of Health and Human Services, shifting to look at the mental health piece of this and the costs associated with that we're seeing at the system level, the lives lost, the years lost. And so that, again, there's a lot of cool attention being paid to it, but in part there's attention being paid to it because it's such a widespread issue. And again, I think this all ties back to how we raise our young people, but also how we raise our young athletes, right? Where so much of their self-worth is tied to outcomes of games or matches that they only have a partial control over, right? I mean, I often use this example when, when I'm talking with my students and thinking about kind of youth sports and the start that people get in sports. When you think about your early experiences, or say you've got a niece or a nephew and, they're coming back from a soccer match and they're 8 or 9 or whatever. They walk in, you're sitting there at the kitchen table. Like, what's the first question that you ask, or we ask generally as a society, is like, hey, did you win? Mm-hmm. And that's we don't mean it in any kind of harmful way, right? We just want to show we're interested. We want to hear what happened, but think about just the very way we phrase that and how we conduct our day-to-day interactions and the long-term kind of cumulative impact that has on all of us, but in particular the athletes who are navigating this. And yeah, it seems innocuous at 8 or 9, but when a 19-year-old is evaluating their self-worth based on this constant barrage of like, well, did I win or did I not win? It's like it's a binary. Was it good or was it bad? Mm-hmm. And as we know, things are so much more complex than that. And so I think that's one of the things that's fed into a lot of the mental health challenges we're seeing around sports. Is we have such an emphasis, particularly in the US, at way too early an age on outcomes, mm-hmm. on performance outcomes, on whether we won. Like, we should not be holding tournaments that are travel tournaments for T-ball, right? But we do. And the message that this continuously reinforces is that your worth as an athlete is tied to whether or not you did this thing and did it well enough. And life is so much more complicated than that. And being an athlete should be so much more complicated than that. So that, when I think about the mental health piece and I look at what we ask of athletes, or that's a friendly way to put it, what we demand that youth athletes commit to. I mean, they sign up for punching the clock at a job by age 6, 7, 8, 9. And it really becomes that, right? It doesn't mean that they might not have fun or they might not find positive experiences and meaning. Nothing is all good, all bad, right? It's this neutral, powerful context. But, we're asking kids to specialize in sports at earlier and earlier ages. We're asking them to invest their free time, themselves, into this year-round process. We're asking them to invest their bodies and their minds into this process too, in ways that aren't necessarily healthy. I know when we think of playing sports, we think of, well, that's good for you. And I know a whole lot of elite athletes who will tell you from a body and mind standpoint, not necessarily a good for you kind of thing. So yeah, and that's to leave aside the overuse injuries and the psychological burnout that we see in the research that comes from just this over investment in young athletes. And it all comes from 99.5% of this comes from a good place. That's something I've really had to reconcile, because as a young researcher in this area who coached and who kind of came to this topic area because I was like, why aren't people having more fun? It should be better, right? Like, we can do this better. I came at it as a young scholar and young professor from the standpoint of like, come on, y'all. Like, we can be better and we should be better. It was almost like this moral or ethical appeal. And what I kind of realized is that in order to meet people where they are, I had to acknowledge that the vast, vast majority of people think they're doing something good and and their heart is, generally speaking, in the right place. They may go about it in a really unproductive and unhealthy way, right? But, and we were talking before we hit record on your, trip to wrestling NCAAs and some of the wrestling parents that you see, around you and in the crowd. And, like we all know what that means, right? We all have been around those parents. Maybe we are those parents. So I had to come to this point of realizing, like, everybody's kind of trying their best on this. It may be a hot mess. It may be not at all producing the outcomes they think that they want. But if we're gonna make change, we have to acknowledge that. We can't try to shame people who think that they're doing the right thing. So, as parents are pouring themselves and their family resources into their kids in a way that to them feels very supportive, very transformational, even like giving their kids the opportunity that maybe they never had. But we have to ask parents to recognize that there are costs associated with that aren't just financial, right? And aren't just time. And so, as we all navigate this process, we have to get to the point where we can, and I hate, like, I default into this language of we must do this, we have to do, but if you are viewing this from my standpoint, you see what a huge problem it is, right? And I have that benefit of being able to zoom out. We're investing so much in our children that it's changing the calculus for us in our brains. When we look at getting a college scholarship, we look at the opportunity to play at the professional level, we're basically buying a lottery ticket, right? But we've convinced ourselves through our regular payments and all that, no, this is actually, we're investing. This isn't some like high yield savings bond, right? That we're investing in. This is a lottery ticket, ultimately. And I know there'll be parents that hear that and say, well, no, not my kid, because I'm talking to you from the zoomed out perspective. When you look at the numbers, when you look at all the factors, your kid may be amazing. And they also may burn out before they even get there, or their body may give out before they even get there. They may walk away because they just don't want to do it anymore. I see that sometimes at even a place like Texas, where, the students that I work with represent a broad spectrum and range of kind of happiness and fulfillment with their college sports experience. But think about that. I mean, there's a ton of students that I work with who aren't that happy, who feel run down and overworked. And these are the kids that won, right? I shouldn't call them kids, but these are the students that they won that lottery. They're at the University of Texas. Like, this is the dream for, most parents and kids who are pursuing this. And so to see it from my perspective and to see how you can even make it to this level and still just kind of either feel lost, feel like you're now all of a sudden a small fish in a big pond, hate your coaches, or your coaches are cruel and abusive. Like, it's not the key to happiness and fulfillment. The key to happiness and fulfillment are things that are not external to us. They're things that are internal that we need to be better about helping equip young athletes with, because that's their only hope of being able to navigate the ups and the downs and the successes and disappointments that come from being an athlete and competing and all the, like the stuff that entails. It's beautiful. It's compelling. It's meaningful, but it's also uncaring, right? And the person on the other side of the aisle the person you're playing against wants it just as bad as you and feels they deserve it just as bad as you. And so if we equate their sense of self-worth and happiness and fulfillment to, who won that, it's zero sum. Like there's only so much. But if we teach and train our young athletes to be more resilient, to understand sport within their lives, not as their life, then we better equip them to be able to navigate what is a really psychologically and physically difficult course to navigate.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the world of, the sports world, it's funny, like you said, I was just at the NCAA wrestling championships, and, there was a kid, Spencer Lee, who was a 3-time NCAA champion and was on the verge of his 4th and got pinned in the semifinals. And he's been a phenom since he was a little kid. Right. And everyone was on this ride to ride him up. And then as soon as he lost, we're right there to bring him right back down. Right. And everybody wants to criticize and stuff like that. And, as a journalist, you're essentially a hype machine. Let's call it what it is. You're building the hype and you're building the context. And as fun as it is to look back at old matches where this NCAA champion wrestled this NCAA champion when they were 7 years old, those types of matches, and mind you, a lot of these kids are from completely different states, right? And you talk about the travel T-ball team. It's the same in just about any sport, right? Where the kids are traveling from state to state as a 7-year-old and competing. And while it's really, really cool to have a really big trophy and, your kid is pushing themselves to be the best, and we have the context to look back on as journalists, is it really the healthiest thing for your kid to be traveling this much as a 7-year-old? Last time I checked, not one kid is being recruited to go to UT or to go and wrestle at Iowa when they're 7. It doesn't happen. There's not recruiters at these events. But what I've started to see and what I've seen in my years of being a journalist and covering sports and covering kids from 5 to 35 is that normally, and you obviously know better than I do with studying it, but normally the younger the kid, the worse the parent. And it's where the parents are so invested because they think laying the groundwork when my kid is 7, 8, 9, 10 is what's going to propel him to being an NCAA champion or being an NFL quarterback when they're 22. And that's not always the truth. And that's just one of the things that I've noticed is like a lot of these parents get so invested in the development of their young kid instead of the investment that they need to put in when it's much later, and it's like, why don't you invest in the kid having fun with the sport as a 10 to 13-year-old? And when they get to high school is when you really start to ramp this up. Why is it that you think that so many parents through, your studying, why do you think so many parents become so invested in what they see from their 8-year-old kid out on the baseball diamond and think that that's what's going to translate to them becoming JJ Watt or Peyton Manning when they get to that age?
Yeah, you've kind of drilled down to fundamental issue, right? And I will say this: I have a 9-year-old son who's a pretty good athlete, and I'll say up front, I can acknowledge how intoxicating it is to see your kid succeeding in a public setting like that. Mm-hmm. And remember, like for a lot of parents with young kids, this is our first chance to publicly, socially compare our children, right? Like they may be better or worse in school, but there's a report card. It's not the whole community has gathered and is watching. It's very primal almost, mm-hmm. right? And so you see your kid succeeding, and that sort of reinforces for you that what you're doing is right. And parenting is hard, and you feel like you're screwing it up a lot as you're doing it. And then you see that it's bringing your kid joy, an identity, And it becomes this sort of self-reinforcing machine where, well, I liked that feeling. She liked that feeling. My daughter or my son or whatever it might be, like, let's keep trying to get that feeling. And you know what will help us? I'll hire a trainer to come in, and twice a week you can put you through drills. So then we can chase and get that feeling like even more. And you enter into, this is going to get a little nerdy and academic. What one of my mentors, a guy named Lawrence Chalop, termed the prisoner's dilemma of youth sports, right? So, and for those of you out there listening or watching, the prisoner's dilemma is this kind of game theory economic framework for explaining basically how we do things that are in our own self-interest in a way where we are creating kind of suboptimal outcomes for everybody more broadly, right? So if I'm a parent of a kid and I see like, geez, we've got scholarship opportunities, we've got pro opportunities, we've got all the fun that comes with that. My kid's pretty good. He's a pretty good basketball player, maybe. Well, shoot, like, let's just play more basketball. Let's put him in more things. Let's do more. And I'm looking down the street, across the alley or whatever, and I see that, like, well, the neighbors have their kid in basketball, and he's on the travel team, and they're going to Houston. It's like, well, but I want that for my kids, so maybe we should do that too, right? You get into this little arms race when all the research on athlete development, high-level athlete development, reinforces that this is a long game, right? This is not something that is won at age 7. It's not something that's won at age 9. And part of the problem here in the U.S. is we have an entire cottage industry, an entire kind of financial infrastructure around selling parents and athletes and coaches even on this idea that they're little professionals, right? And by being little professionals, that makes them more likely to be big professionals down the road. But development is not linear. And so in the US, the way, I won't get too into the weeds on this, but we have tended to adopt a policy approach when it comes to kids and sports that says, hey, we're not going to intervene, at like the national level. We'll let the local levels, let the market kind of figure it out, and the cream will rise to the top and all that. That's served us well in some ways, right? And we're fortunate to have an incredibly diverse athletic population that almost makes us look better in spite of the way we do things, versus because of it. But, we have a setup that doesn't really protect children and doesn't value their part in this process at the level that I think it should. And there are other national models out there that Norway, for example, has gotten a lot of press for the way that they do youth sports, and they're very stringent on protecting. They actually have a children's bill of rights for sports, protecting the experience and keeping it from too much adult intervention. And you look at Norway, and they clean up in the Winter Olympics. They've got one of the great strikers in all of men's soccer, that they've produced. A bunch of high-level athletes, kind of showcasing that system can work, even while protecting athletes, even while not allowing them to specialize in sports until they reach a certain age, even not even keeping score, which I know is in the U.S. like,
it's like the worst thing ever.
Yeah, it's in Revelations for the cause for the apocalypse or whatever. But I don't expect us in the U.S. to necessarily do that. But does that mean that we should just continue to let this sort of lack of system run roughshod and churn kids and parents and coaches in and out. Like, I feel like I'm evangelizing a little bit more than I necessarily intend to. I try to be detached as an academic, to make sure that you don't become blinded by your own inclinations and passions and things. But to me, it's an ethical issue. Like, we're not protecting children. We're not protecting, and I'm not just talking about the truly atrocious, what we've seen with USA Gymnastics and sexual abuse. And that's obvious, right? But we're not even protecting the baseline level of the experience of childhood and letting kids have the opportunity to play a bunch of different sports, to find themselves through sports in the way that we believe sports can offer. And so, it's this fascinating challenge that we have where the way things are structured themselves kind of pull us toward this prisoner's dilemma, this arms race, when virtually all of the research on athlete development and who makes it and who does, suggests that we should pull back from that. Do I expect us to? No, I don't. Without some sort of better kind of top-down intervention or whatever, I don't think that left to our own devices, we're going to be able to get to the point where we all step back collectively and say, you're right. Everybody just cool off for a second. Let's take a breath. Because the stakes are high, right? Like, oh, cool. While Ryan and Matt are stepping back, I'm going to put my daughter in there and she's going to get a year ahead of them, right? And their kids or whatever. So it's a really fascinating issue. And nobody has all the answers to it, right? It's very complex and there's a lot of factors at play. We've only just kind of started to unpack those, and you can, if you're listening or watching this, like, you can see how difficult it is to navigate and think about, well, what could we do to solve that? We don't have a lot of in our arsenal to be able to address the fundamental issues that are creating the conditions that are suboptimal, that we shouldn't be happy about.
Yeah. So Matt, this has been a great conversation, and now we're to the point where call 5 questions. It's 5 quick questions and answers. And the first question for you is, when you first started studying, what was something that kind of gave you that epiphany that you were in the right place, that this is what you truly wanted to do?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I should have prepped these, shouldn't I? That's honestly, getting to that epiphany moment for me, I referenced earlier, where I was like, wait, as a professor, I can help people. I can be in the space that I'm already fascinated by. I was fascinated by it as a coach, but that I can do that in a way where the things that I didn't like as much about coaching, I didn't really have to deal with. And the things I did like a lot about coaching, helping people develop, helping people reach their potential, helping groups collectively become better tomorrow than they were today. Like, those are the things that it was a epiphany kind of moment to realize, like, that's what I'm really interested in. The things beneath the surface, not necessarily the things at the surface themselves. And that's not an easy thing to see when you're, it's like, how does a fish know it's wet? Like, when you're in it, it's not as easy to see, but having that moment to step out and say, oh, I still get to do a lot of the stuff that I thought I was going to miss. It was a pretty important moment for me.
Yeah. As a young athlete, and you mentioned always paying probably more attention to the GM front office side of things. What was something that happened in, maybe basketball or football or one of these free agency type sports that really kind of intrigued you to dig a little deeper?
Well, again, I think I kind of referenced this earlier, but I just became, so I was a fan, I still am a fan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Tampa Bay Rays, the Tampa Bay Lightning, Orlando Magic, that geographic region of teams. And while some of those teams have become good and had really good stretches, when I was a kid, they either didn't exist yet or they were the Bucks, who were I mean, we're talking the worst franchise in the history of professional sports in the United States, right? Statistically speaking. So I was just so interested in why am I being punished? Right? Like why are we so pathetic? And that just kind of like continued to fuel me. And so I actually I'm really fortunate to be able to teach a class at the University of Texas. It's what we call a signature course for incoming freshmen. It's supposed to be a fun course that like shows them, hey, learning can be fun. College will be great. Mm-hmm. And it's a class that's called Building Winning Teams, where we actually use sports as the vehicle to teach freshmen from all different majors how to create and sustain high performing groups in what they do. So, you know, it's pretty neat to be able to like take that initial sort of seed that's planted and like be able to, through your own, you know, through watering it with your own fascination and attention, kind of grow it to the point where it's something other people can enjoy and think about too.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's an early project or a project you're working on now or something, but what's a project for you that you've always been really, really proud of?
Ooh, that's a nice question too. You know, I would say the work that I've been able to contribute as a part of a whole that the Aspen Institute's Project Play is doing is something that is, you know, where we've gotten to see the impact, right? We've got all these stakeholders at the table, you know, from the NCAA and the NBA and Pop Warner football and the USOC. I mean, everybody has been brought to the table through the hard work of the Aspen Institute and Tom Ferry, just to be able to play a modest role in some of the projects and things that have produced meaningful change in the youth sports space is definitely something I'm really proud of, because this is an area that again has a human component to it, right? Some people study geology, some people study, you know, but like the things that I'm fascinated, and that was no shade at geologists, just an example. But like, there's a human component to understanding how we make sports better serve kids and all participants, not just at the kid level, but when we're talking about developing athletes, it necessarily starts there, because that's where it all begins. So, I think being able to see some real positive change, to see how that improves and impacts people's lives is pretty meaningful.
Yeah. So who are some of the, you know, maybe the other authors or researchers that you've either studied or worked with that have had maybe the biggest impact on you?
Yeah. And this is the point in the show where the audience is like, all right, nerd stuff, enough. No, I mean, I really appreciate the question, because, and I've referenced Lawrence Chalop, for example. He's one of the great, he's actually being inducted into our Hall of Honor at the University of Texas next week. He's currently at George Mason University and is coming back for that. But he's someone whose thinking has really shaped a lot of mine. My doctoral advisor, who also works closely with Lawrence, a woman named Chris Green, also someone I've learned so much from, particularly on the athlete development side. And so, you know, whether you are going to hear this and then run and look through the archives to find these articles and things, or not, as a listener, as a viewer, I do encourage you. There's a lot of work being done, a lot of people writing interesting stuff, a lot happening in this space. There's a ton of cool resources from John O'Sullivan's, Changing the Game. The Reform Sport podcast is fun. There's a community out there that is recognizing that we can be better. We can do this better, and we kind of owe it to ourselves and our kids to try to move that needle, in spite of the fact that it's hard and it's not going to necessarily come easily. So yeah, if you're listening to this and you're thinking about resources or whatever, you can always reach out to me at my university email, or via LinkedIn or something like that. But yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff going on, a lot of resources, a lot of good thinkers in this space right now. So
yeah. Now, with this entire conversation has been probably, one nugget of wisdom and advice after another, but to kind of, I always love to leave a note of advice before we finish. So for coaches, parents, even athletes that are listening to this, what's kind of a piece of advice that you could leave with them, either through your research or your experience, or, something that has been told to you over the years that you really think that, like I said, the coaches, athletes, parents should definitely know?
Great question. Try to come up with something that's got a little ring to it here. How about less can be more, right? I think our natural inclination with helping our children, whether we're a coach, whether we're a parent, develop as athletes, our natural inclination is pouring as much as possible into them and asking as much as possible of them is going to produce or move them along this developmental pathway more quickly. And again, it's a long game. It's okay to feel like pulled toward wanting to intervene more, wanting to do more, and it's okay to pull back from that, to give them a chance to play multiple sports, to allow them to rest. I mean, you look at just the emerging science around recovery, right? At the highest levels on down now, rest is so critical. And so it's really hard, but recognizing that less can actually be more in the long run in a number of ways, that when we think about developing elite athletes, is something that I hope people will maybe pause from time to time and consider and think about, because it's not intuitive. It requires actively questioning your natural tendency or instinct on a lot of this stuff. But the literature on athlete development is all pretty clear about the fact that it's okay. It's okay to not be pushing, and doing that might actually not take you to where you want to go.
Mm-hmm. So Matt, this has been great. I really appreciate all the insight. Really appreciate you taking some time to kind of impart a lot of the wisdom that, parents, coaches, athletes should certainly know. I'm going to let you get back to a nice sunny day there in Texas. But like I said, I really, really appreciate it. And do you have anything else for us before I let you go?
No, I just want to thank you. I mean, the podcast that you all are doing by highlighting the athlete stories. I know I'm a little bit of a different kind of perspective than sometimes we usually get with the A2A podcast, but just shining a light on the fact that there's a human element to all of this, right? And that happiness and fulfillment and success come from better understanding who we are, and from, finding a fit with who we are and with the world that's out there. So for a lot of us, that comes through sports. But, thinking with more nuance about what that can or should be, is really important and actually going to have a really positive impact on the experiences of current and future student athletes. So thank you to you and your crew for doing good work. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. And I'll definitely be digging into a lot more of your research here very soon. As I was doing my research for this interview, I just kept going deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. And, it's always awesome to see how things have changed from a nuanced perspective. And, I love the work that you're doing as well. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And hook 'em. I think I'm legally obligated to hook 'em. But I appreciate it. And look forward to continuing to tune in for future A2A podcasts too.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Athletes to Athletes podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. To engage with everything the A2A platform has to offer, go to the App Store and search Athletes to Athletes to download our new app. You can check out our educational material, and you'll ensure that you don't miss when a new episode of the A2A podcast drops. Again, thank you for listening. We'll see you again next time.